From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $50 Million Studio. I'm the Pro Wrestle Machine. Wrestling fans, it's time to lace up your boots and step into the squared circle. Tonight, we're delving deep into the Wrestling Observer newsletter dated May 4th, 1998. A time when the wrestling world was on fire with controversy and excitement. From the Monday Night Wars between the WWF and WCW to the Attitude Era's rise to prominence, this edition of the newsletter is a treasure trove of insider information and behind-the-scenes insights. Now, through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine, May 4th, 1998 Wrestling Observer newsletter, Bagwell neck injury, more on Flair WCW lawsuit, tons more. By Observer staff. For perhaps the first time in the recent history of live television wrestling, reality took a front seat due to a serious neck injury suffered by Marcus Bagwell during the live WCW Thunder broadcast on April 22 from Columbia, South Carolina. Bagwell suffered 4 crushed vertebrae in his neck from a whiplash type of effect as his head slipped out of a Rick Steiner bulldog headlock off the top rope, but crashed on impact on Steiner's back and snapped backwards with a sickening jolt. Because he was unable to move his arms and legs temporarily, both the live card and the planned television fare had to be halted for nearly 30 minutes before they could get the right type of stretcher for him and safely remove him from the ring and take him to a nearby hospital. After being transferred to a hospital in Atlanta the next day, he underwent lengthy neck and spinal surgery on April 27 to fuse the C3 and C4 vertebrae together and also the C5 and C6 vertebrae together. He had some serious complications later that evening coming out of surgery with his esophagus, which led to his blood pressure dropping drastically and him being in danger of going into a life-threatening coma. At press time the next day, Bagwell was listed in stable condition. The doctor's prognosis was that given his age, 28, and his level of physical conditioning, that the odds were he would make nearly a full recovery and would be able to return to the ring, although the timetable is expected to be 6 months before he can return to training and 1 year before he can return to the ring. Bagwell was also told that the injury was 3 centimeters away from being a duplicate of the injury suffered by actor Christopher Reeve, which would have rendered him paralyzed for life, and that his strong musculature helped save him. However, that strong musculature probably worked against him in the surgery because the surgeons would have had to cut through far more muscle than an average person to address his neck problems. Bagwell suffered the injury working toward the finish of a tag match with he and Scott Norton against Steiner and Lex Luger. After taking the Bulldog, the finish was that Vincent would threaten Steiner with a chair, which would bring out Scott Steiner, who would suddenly grab the chair from Vincent, teasing that he was protecting his brother. Of course, at that point, with Rick covering Bagwell, Scott hit with Rick the chair and went to put Bagwell on top. The problem was that Bagwell was motionless. Ref Mark Curtis counted the fall as planned, although it was clear Bagwell still was motionless and had to clumsily raise Norton's hand to designate the planned winner of the match. As Bagwell laid in the ring, not moving, with the exception of uttering words, inaudible on television to Norton and with huge Norton's reaction, almost breaking down in tears in the middle of the ring, it became obvious this was no pro wrestling work. After a commercial break, when they came back, Bagwell was still in the ring. At this point, Tony Schiavone basically took over the broadcast. It was a very unique situation, as you had paid wrestling shills put in a strange position of a legitimate potential tragedy going on right before their eyes, while at the same time being in the position of arguably not wanting to waste valuable television time without hyping the major storyline in the company involving Hulk Hogan. What made the situation doubly unique is 2 of the 3 announcers in the booth at the time, Schiavone and Bobby Heenan. Mike Tenay was the third. Both have undergone serious neck surgeries in recent years, and the sympathetic projections they were giving off was probably the closest thing to 100% reality that you'll ever see on a wrestling broadcast. What made things even more troubling is that the initial word, when Bagwell was laying in the ring immobile, that they had received was Bagwell having no feeling in his arms and legs, but at the same time the feeling from management on how to position it to the public was to not ignore the issue at hand, but certainly try to slightly downplay how severe the injury was feared to be at the time. What was also interesting was the live crowd reaction. It was as if everyone in the building recognized rather quickly that this wasn't a wrestling angle and the role Bagwell played became totally insignificant in everyone's mind. After approximately 15 minutes, much of which was spent with the cameras on the motionless Bagwell with all sorts of medical personnel on hand attending to him, the cameras pulled off Bagwell into the announcers. Almost apologetically, Schiavone said that they would show a tape of the finish of the WCW title change that took place 2 days earlier. As the announcers voiced it over, it was their own tone that was the reality of how the main angle in the fictional story was really so meaningless when faced with a scary reality, The issue of how to handle a situation of reality in a fictional product, and while rare, it is certainly not a first, as recent deaths of Louis Spicolli and Brian Pillman on the day before Monday night shows has seen both WWF and WCW take totally opposite tacks. In hindsight, the only thing debatable about the opposite tacks was which in reality was the more reprehensible, is always an interesting issue in the wake of the Bagwell injury. My own feeling is that from an announcing perspective, Schiavone and Heenan, perhaps drawing on their own injuries, could not have done a better job. The other reality is that a live television show is going on and there is a finite time that you can show a ring with a crowd gathered around an injured wrestler. However, the decision to air the Hogan Savage footage, particularly without going with the original announcing soundtrack and having visibly shaken announcers to a re-voice over of it, made for worse television escaping from the reality than the reality. As the show went on, the announcers promised updates, and in usual pro wrestling fashion, when that is promised, is never delivered. In this case it was, although what was said on television was a far more optimistic situation involving Bagwell than was thought to be at the time. Apparently whoever was calling the real shots here, more than likely Eric Bischoff, did have qualms about viewers being told just how serious the injuries could have been and were legitimately thought to be. There was no substantive news this past week on what was certainly the most talked about issue of the week, the legal situation involving Ric Flair in World Championship Wrestling. The two sides were said to still be at an impasse, but apparently at least a somewhat cordial impasse. There is an apparent realization that with the 3-year contract and the bitter competition on the U.S. scene, that, similar to Owen Hart in the wake of the Bret Hart Survivor Series finish, inevitably Flair will return, and more likely than not when he does, some form of an angle will be worked stemming from what has taken place. If that is the way things work out, it will validate the theory by many within the organization that it was all, or at least a great part of it, a work from the beginning, although at this point virtually everyone well connected to the parties that is aware of the current maneuverings due to the fact lawyers are involved and settlement talks have taken place recognizes the problems with Flair and Bischoff, and the lawsuit itself, which still exists and is being used by media throughout the Southeast mainly as comedy fodder to show that pro wrestling isn't real, are not part of a ruse. But because the crux of the legal issues appear to have already been smoothed over, the lawsuit may very well have been filed as either a scare tactic against Flair, or perhaps using the Flair situation to scare other talent under contract thinking of either not cooperating with storylines or thinking of trying to walk out on their contract in an attempt to get fired. As best we can tell, on April 21st in Atlanta, lawyers for both WCW and Flair met and there were settlement talks that both Flair and Bischoff were involved with. The lawsuit at press time was still unsettled, but except for some minor points which largely involving face saving for both individuals, the legal situation is no longer as heated. There is the belief that the real crux of the issue right now is how this impasse can be resolved, with Flair still wanting to renegotiate his deal, and Bischoff still wanting Flair to make some sort of an admittance that he was apologizing over the problems to allow Bischoff save some face after telling the other wrestlers that Flair was done with the company. As the week went on, more information has been learned, most of which seems to indicate at least the beginnings of the problems were a shoot. Some, or a large part of it, could be an angle, or may very well turn into an angle, although the evidence against that being the case includes 1. Why would there be legitimate settlement talks with the lawyers involved if the lawsuit itself was just a publicity stunt? 2. If the lawsuit was a publicity stunt to further a storyline, why is it that Flair's absence is never mentioned on television? Remember, the vast majority of the WCW wrestling audience has no idea any of this is going on. 3. If the lawsuit is only to build an angle for Bischoff versus Flair, why didn't Bischoff sue Flair rather than WCW, which from a storyline standpoint Bischoff isn't even involved with, because this lawsuit doesn't fit into such an angle unless Flair returns and goes against WCW? If the lawsuit is a worked lawsuit, then Bischoff should have been the one suing representing WCW. 4. Why does the lawsuit mention how much money Flair earns? Because most wrestling fans probably believe Flair earns well into 7 figures like virtually all major sports stars of comparative renown and stature. 5. Why does the WWF mention Flair in positive terms on its television if he's involved in a big angle with WCW? The answer to those not-so-nagging questions can be very simple. All the other WCW storylines don't hold up to any scrutiny either. Another WCW employee informed us this past week that he had known several months ago of Flair's son's participation in the tournament and that Flair qualified for the tournament by placing second in a national tournament 1 year earlier. There was also the word that Bischoff blew up when returning from Japan and finding out for the first time while listening to a WCW hotline report that Flair wasn't going to be in Tallahassee as was announced on TV 3 days earlier. Clearly there is a communications breakdown somewhere. The lawsuit story over the past week was picked up in newspapers and television stations throughout the Carolinas, where Flair is the local wrestling icon. Even though the story has gotten significant media play, including front-page coverage in the April 24 Charlotte Observer, virtually no details of the actual story, such as the reasons Flair missed the Tallahassee shot, other than the existence of the lawsuit, have been picked up on by the mainstream media. Most of the stories have focused more on the lawsuit's admission that pro wrestling events are staged, an outdated story if ever there was one, with the fact WCW was suing Flair as a secondary part of the story, even in the Carolinas where Flair's name value is the highest. The AP later picked up on the story more due to the admission in the lawsuit that pro wrestling angles were scripted, and it got some national play. The news stories in the Southeast created a groundswell at live wrestling events for both WWF and WCW, which were held in Flair's stomping grounds this past week. In Columbia, South Carolina at the Thunder tapings, there was loud "We Want Flair" chants before the show went on the air, and one loud audible chant during the show along with numerous smaller versions of the chant. At the WWF pay-per-view show in Greensboro, there was a loud "We Want Flair" chant during an angle involving Jeff Jarrett and Steve Blackman after Jarrett had used the figure 4. There was talk over the week of internet-fueled boycotts of WCW advertisers and protests and pickets at live WCW events, and some activities of that type did take place at the Nitro tapings on April 27 in Norfolk. The Norfolk area was the site of perhaps the latest installation of what is becoming an even more bitter pro wrestling war. Ever since the coincidence, and anyone who has followed this industry for any length of time realizes things like this are never a coincidence, of WCW booking Nitro in Norfolk and WWF booking Raw in Hampton, just 30 miles away. Both sides were at war, both in trying to get jump on the all-important first-day ticket sales, a battle WWF won by a few days, and in trying to outdraw the other. As it turned out, wrestling, particularly television tapings, have gotten so hot since the 2 days were booked in the same market, that both shows sold out well in advance, with WCW ending up with 9,594, 8,962 paying $168,695 at the Scope, and WWF with 7,512 paying $126,030 at the Hampton Coliseum. As was also expected, given that Nitro was tape delayed with a 1-hour showing starting after midnight due to TNT having commitments to carry 2 NBA playoff games, Raw set its all-time record rating. What wasn't expected is that the old Raw record was broken by more than 1 full point, with a 5.71 rating, 5.53 first hour, 5.89 seconds hour, and 8.20 share in 4,188,000 homes. It was the highest television rating in not only the history of Monday Night Television but also became the single most watched pro wrestling show in the history of cable television. It broke the Monday Night ratings record and all-time audience record set by Nitro on March 16 with the Spring Breakout show, which also went unopposed and did a 5.58 rating and 8.48 share in 4,083,000 homes. The previous all-time ratings record for a Raw broadcast was on April 8, 1996, which was also an unopposed show because TNT aired NBA playoffs against them, which drew a 4.7 rating, largely for the return of Ultimate Warrior to television after a lengthy absence, and matches with Shawn Michaels vs. Jerry Lawler for the WWF title and Yokozuna vs. Vader, which was the first episode of Raw ever to reach 3 million homes. The first hour of Nitro, which aired after the NBA playoffs post-game show at approximately 12:30 a.m. Eastern Time, drew a 1.7 rating and 5.6 share. The other 2 hours of Nitro aired from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time on April 29, and ratings were unavailable at press time. With only one game in town, the normal ratings fluctuations weren't there, and actually the peak quarter hour was a 6.06 rating and 8.6 share for the New Age Outlaws vs. Skull and 8-ball non-title match and Undertaker vs. Barry Windham match in 4,439,000 homes, breaking the Raw quarter-hour record of a 6.02 rating and 4,414,000 homes set by the Vince McMahon-Steve Austin non-match, but obviously the latter mark being that another highly rated wrestling show was going on at the same time is far more impressive. Raw's main event of Steve Austin vs. Goldust for the WWF title, with the storyline of McMahon trying to steal the title again, did a 6.00 rating and 9.4 share in 4,402,000 homes. The Raw show was a soap opera deal building to the final quarter, playing the dual reality game again. Dude Love came out expecting another title shot based on his performance the night before. McMahon instead announced Goldust would get the shot, with Gerald Briscoe as ref, and if Austin touched the ref he'd be fired and stripped of the title, using phraseology including the time-honored tradition, the one about promoters screwing wrestlers. line to again hint at a repeat of Survivor Series. Then backstage, Dude Love, out of his Dude Love character, confronted McMahon basically saying he agreed to wear tie-dye for McMahon but that he should be getting the shot in McMahon screaming at the cameras and mics to be turned off, and later in the show to set up a Dude Love vs. Goldust singles program. Dude attacked Goldust during an interview. The match itself ended with McMahon removing Mark Eaton as timekeeper, being constantly ready to ring the bell as Briscoe kept attempting to fast count Austin. Finally Austin hit the stunner and after Briscoe counted 2, he feigned as if something was in his eye and he couldn't see or count. Basic copy of the Nick Patrick gimmick. Dude Love then attacked Austin and they brawled and Briscoe refused to call a DQ. It wound up with McMahon attempting to hit Austin with a chair, but Austin ducking and McMahon knocking out Briscoe. At that point, without sending in a second ref or a decision being rendered, like the previous night, they simply played Austin's music to signal the match was over without a decision. But perhaps the most intriguing part of the Raw show were a series of tapes from earlier in the night when DX drove a tank to the Norfolk Scope before the WCW show started to cut promos. In the first segment, they fired a blank in the direction of the arena claiming they were taking the first shot in the war. They also carefully spliced the crawl on the marquee at the Scope for a different event where all the tickets were free, and made it appear that the tickets were free for Nitro. Several times in later segments DX referred to all the free tickets WCW gives away. There were 632 free tickets, 307 comps and 328 media trades, which is actually an unusually low figure for today's wrestling, in order to make it appear its buildings are sold out. In response on Nitro later that night, Tony Schiavone noted that the Scope had been sold out for months, well, several weeks, and that 30 miles down the road they can't even give tickets away. Well, actually that event was sold out as well with not that all that many free tickets given away, few free. Most of the segments were stupid, with Hunter Hearst Helmsley asking the crowd earlier in the day. What was bad is that it was bright daylight and this was purported to be live airing at 9:30 p.m. if Eric Bischoff sucks and they agreed and then asked if WCW sucks and they didn't react nearly as well to that. Later they were asking if anyone had all those free tickets WCW gives away to fill the building for its TV shows. It ended up hilarious when Sean Waltman was kicking the back door of the building trying to get in saying that it was Sean Waltman and he wanted to ask Eric Bischoff why he fired him so he could tell him face to face instead of by FedEx letter. Helmsley earlier had a funny line when they again acted as if Kevin Nash and Scott Hall would rather be in WWF but were being held against their will, and Helmsley talked about Hall and Nash as being his friends and said to Bischoff, "Let my people go." It's petty and childish, but that is pro wrestling circa 1998 and as mentioned before, the one thing people do believe is real is that the two companies hate each other. The next day, one top executive from WWF called another from WCW and basically tried to apologize over the incident, claiming it wasn't done to make WCW look bad. Not sure if he also tried to tell him the moon is made of green cheese. WCW is at a major disadvantage through the latter part of May due to other sports dominating TBS and TNT programming, both in ratings comparisons and also in promotion of the May 17th Slamboree pay-per-view show from Worcester, Massachusetts, and the current set of house shows. TNT and WCW won't even learn until May 1st what the time slot will be for Nitro on May 4th and or May 5th, because the NBA schedule for May 4th won't be finalized. Unlike this past week, where they were able to get the information of the time slot on Thunder, for the next 2 weeks Thunder is preempted completely, and most of the Saturday shows over the next month are 55 minutes in length. To make things worse, with limited promotional opportunities, at press time only 2 matches on the May 17th show have been finalized, a tag title match with Kevin Nash and Scott Hall versus The Giant and Sting, and a singles match with Bret Hart versus Randy Savage, billed as their first singles meeting ever. Actually, they've had at least 2 major previous matches, a Saturday night's main event match in late 1987 that Savage won by a pinfall, and a WWF title match in 1994 in Japan that Hart won with the sharpshooter. 2 other matches are probables: a cruiserweight title match with Chris Jericho versus Dean Malenko, and a singles match with Ultimo Dragon versus Eddie Guerrero. WCW, which had been above the 1.0 buy rate mark for its previous 4 pay-per-view shows, fell to around an 0.7 buy rate for the April 19th Spring Stampede show from Denver, and that's with Hogan on the show. And while this was all going on, the WWF's Unforgiven pay-per-view took place on April 26th at the Greensboro Coliseum, drawing the largest crowd in the story's history of Greensboro to the newly enlarged building. As a show it was an interesting spectacle, far more glitzy and more soap opera-ish than recent WCW pay-per-view events, but as is typical with a comparison, lacking once again in comparative wrestling depth, finishing off with a stronger main event, and for the most part delivering match finishes that, rather than add to the storyline, seem more like quickie ideas to get out of matches. In fact, in the current WWF reinvention of pro wrestling, the idea of a finish in some cases no longer exists. Simply done, it's a play without a finish, and when the music plays, whether there is any rhyme or reason for it playing, the play is over. The record crowd of a sellout 21,427 broke the old Greensboro record of 19,000, which was a Coliseum sellout and a packed closed circuit showing adjacent for Starrcade 86. The paid attendance was 20,268. The gate mark of $341,270 fell shy of the $380,000 record set at that Starrcade event, but the merchandise total of $165,572 totally blew away any figure ever in the market. The show was built around a storyline playing off the Survivor Series finish with Vince screw Steve Austin. The evil Vince, building to his eventual babyface turn, forced Jim Ross to apologize on television for even hinting at the obvious, which served to only make Austin even stronger by his refusal to knuckle down. The storyline is that while, yes, Bret Hart was screwed, the difference is that Austin in the same situation was tough enough to stop management from screwing him. There were some interesting crowd reactions to the angle. While Vince McMahon got the heel reaction doing his anti-Austin promo, when he built up to the crux phrase, about Stone Cold screwed Stone Cold, the crowd didn't respond. The promised catastrophe, the idea that McMahon would screw Austin out of the title, turned out instead to be Austin clocking McMahon with a chair and McMahon selling it as if he was dead, all the way to a lengthy build-up to a stretcher job that ended the show. However, the reaction to this was so totally different, as perhaps it should have been, than to what happened a few days earlier on WCW television, that really nobody cared about the apparent misfortune to the man who has been pushed on television as lead heel. Fans were emptying the arena in droves as the show was still on the air, with the reaction to McMahon's misfortune being neither the expected joy nor sadness that would be the reaction if they actually took it seriously, but apathy. 1. Farouk, Ron Simmons, and Ken Shamrock and Steve Blackman beat D'Lo Brown, A.C. Connor, and Mark Henry and Rocky Maivia, Wayne Johnson, in 1307. Shamrock was basically a spectator due to torn ligaments in his foot, which were diagnosed later this past week stemming from the angle at the April 13th television taping, as he was only in briefly. This forced Blackman to carry the bulk of the match since Farouk was there just for the two spots, where Rocky would tag in while he's down and get some heat on him, and his big finish where he'd pin Rocky to set up their new IC title program. Brown carried the match for his side since the story was Rocky wanting no part of Farouk, and Henry, while at least bordering unwatchable, is nowhere near ready to be a key player in a good match. After the hot tag brought in a fresh Farouk with Rocky, Rocky used a DDT for a near fall before Farouk got the pin on him using a sloppy Dominator. 1/2 of 1 star. Austin came out for an interview and warned timekeeper Mark Eaton that if he rang the bell, as he did at Survivor Series, he'd beat the hell out of him all over the building. 2. Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Paul Levesque, retained the European title, pinning Owen Hart in 12:23. The two brawled in the aisle for a short time before the match. Chyna was put in a cage and hung first above the ring, and later to the side of the ring. They had a solid, but not great match, while as a concurrent storyline, Chyna was playing games upstairs. At first she tried to use a nail file, but dropped it into the ring. Strangely, it never became a factor in the match. Then she, with her superhuman strength, pried apart the bars of the cage, but was still too high off the ground to jump out. She still climbed out, teased the big jump, even hung upside down from the cage. Most of while this was going on, Helmsley was using a dragon sleeper as a rest hold. Hart made a comeback and got near falls using a German suplex, a belly-to-belly, an enzudri, a pile driver and an elbow off top. As Chyna teased jumping, Hart was distracted, allowing Helmsley to gain an advantage. However, Helmsley wound up tied upside down in the ropes while Chyna was hanging off the cage. Hart hit a DDT and put on the sharpshooter. At this point Jesse James lowered the cage, allowing Chyna to escape, distracting Hart again. This brought out Sergeant Slaughter to keep Chyna at bay while Hart had Helmsley pinned once again, but this time X-Pac ran out and clocked Hart with a fire extinguisher for the pin. Good match. Bad finish. 2 3/4 stars. 3. Midnight Express, Robert Howard and Mike Polchlepeek beat Rock and Roll Express, Richard Morton and Reuben Kane, in 7:20 to retain the NWA tag titles. There was a big entrance pop for the Rock and Rolls, but once the match started, the crowd treated this as the popcorn match. They did a bunch of 80s spots where the Midnights would bump into each other. There was nothing wrong with the execution, Other than it was a step slow and nobody cared and came off as an old-timers match, even though the participants were all younger than most of WCW's headliners, and that isn't going to play well with today's fans. Jim Cornette did a routine where he challenged Ref Tim White to fight and then backed down. Jim Ross said this was the third incarnation of Midnight Expresses, using Bobby Eaton and Dennis Condrey as the originals, and Eaton and Stan Lane as the sequels. Actually, this would be the fourth, as the originals were Condrey, Randy Rose and Norval Austin in Alabama. Typical match, getting heat on Morton and hot tagging Gibson for the finish. Morton is nothing compared to what he once was, but is almost passable, but Gibson can't play the role anymore except on small-town shows where he can be a nostalgia act. They did the double dropkick on Bart, but Cornette ran in for the save and ended up dropping an elbow on Bart. Gibson then had Bart pinned with a rolling reverse cradle, but Holly delivered a bulldog on Gibson and put Bart on top for the pin. 1 star. 4. Luna Gertrude Vachon beat Sable Rena Mero in 2:35 of the stripper match. Sable got a huge pop coming out, causing Ross to say you'd think Ric Flair walked out. With Sable injured and not wanting to expose that her WrestleMania stuff was a series of carefully designed spots and it was the men who carried the match, it was kept short. They did some ripping at close until Luna scored the first major blow, ripping the bottom of Sable's dress off, so we got to see her panties. Mark Mero showed up and began arguing with Sable, allowing Luna to come from behind and rip the rest of her dress off, leaving her in her bra and ending the match. Without the ridiculous boob job, Sable has a phenomenal body for her age, but with it, she looks like just another aging low-rent stripper, but through the magic of being on a high-profile television show, she is a star. Sable ended up powerbombing Luna again and ripping her dress off, and the two wound up under the ring. Sable then came out holding Luna's bra and panties, giving the illusion she was naked under the ring. Goldust gave her his robe, and she left in that, which is the old Southern wrestling trick and how to get out of stripper matches. Obviously this wasn't a wrestling match, but it did deliver what it advertised. 1/2 of 1 star. Vince McMahon came out for an interview and said that the very idea that he would screw a wrestler is beneath his dignity. He mentioned having grown up in Pinehurst, North Carolina, a shoot, and built up to the big line of saying that he hoped Stone Cold wouldn't screw Stone Cold, which got no pop. 5. New Age Outlaws, Brian James and Monty Sopp, retained the WWF tag titles, beating LOD 2000, Joe Laurinaitis and Mike Hegstrand in 12-13. The Outlaws claimed that Dean Smith, legendary local basketball coach, was going to be in their corner but came out with a blow-up doll that they called Dean Smith. That didn't get the heat you'd think. Typical LOD match. The stuff with Animal is decent and the stuff with Hawk ranges from bad to embarrassing. Finally they teased doing the Doomsday Device on Road Dogg, but Billy Gunn clipped Animal from behind. They mainly worked on Animal's knee for the next several minutes. Animal came back with the single worst-looking dragon screw and recorded mat history on Gunn and the hot tag to Hawk. After Hawk splashed Gunn from off the top, Road Dogg hit Hawk with the belt, but Hawk kicked out. Finish saw Hawk deliver a German suplex on Road Dogg, but ref Jack Doan only looked at Hawk's shoulders while counting 3, not seeing Dogg's shoulders also on the mat. They teased as if it were a title change until the ring announcers said the Outlaws had retained the title. LOD then did the Doomsday Device on ref Doan, who took probably the best bump thus far in the show, and Doan did a stretcher job. I wonder if someone with a calculator can figure out how many times the LOD has been involved in finishes similar to this in this part of the country. 3/4 of a star. Jeff Jarrett sang with the country music group Sawyer Brown. As many know, Mark Miller, the lead singer of the group, went to high school with Ron and Don Harris, and they've remained friends since that time. Jarrett had practiced with them for a while and as a singer did a good job. It's funny that for all his actual talent, even after this when he showed up to his huge ring in trance the next night on Raw, that still nobody cared. Anyway, after one song, this turned into an angle as Steve Blackman attacked him, but Tennessee Lee clocked Blackman with a guitar from behind. Jarrett then put Blackman in the figure 4 while the crowd loudly started the "We Want Flair" chants. 6. Undertaker Mark Calloway beat Kane Glenn Jacobs in an Inferno match in 1557. While this wasn't the first ring surrounded by fire match, it had been done previously in both Puerto Rico and later Japan. It differed from the previous ones in that they put cloth on the ropes and used gasoline to start the flames, making those matches considerably more dangerous. But this was held in an indoor building and the special effects in those matches were primitive in comparison. Again, with the exception of one spectacular dive out of the ring by Undertaker, This wasn't much of a wrestling match, but it was an interesting spectacle to watch two guys not doing much of anything in a ring surrounded by flames. The fans reacted more to the flames going up and down than to the moves in the match. After a choke slam, Kane tried a tombstone, but Undertaker slipped away from it. Undertaker came back with a choke slam, but Kane sat up from it. The two did the exact same double high kick spot that Giant and Nash did 1 week earlier on pay-per-view. Kane used a side slam and went to the top, but Undertaker shook the ropes and Kane lost his balance. Undertaker climbed up and used a superplex and threw Kane over the top rope. At this point Kane went to walk out to the dressing room, but Vader returned and brawled with Kane back to the ring area. Undertaker then did a great Sasuke-like running dive over the top rope onto both of them, which for a guy his size is dangerous as hell. Paul Bearer then hit Undertaker with a chair, but it was a no-sell spot. Undertaker clocked Kane with a chair, which Kane sold huge as he was knocked out laying with his arm under the ring. This gave the special effects people a chance to wrap Kane's arm up with a protective sleeve under the ring while the crowd was distracted by Undertaker brawling with Paul Bearer in the music stage, including Taker putting a drum over Bearer's head and causing him to juice and hitting him with a mic stand. When he got back in the ring and Kane was set up for the stunt, Undertaker kicked Kane into the flames and he ran to the back. Kind of ECW style in that there was a lot of bad wrestling, but the well set up big spots of the match gave things to make the match memorable. 2 3/4 stars. 7. Dude Love, Michael Foley, beat Steve Austin, Steve Williams, via DQ so Austin retained the WWF title in 1852. An incredible performance of bump taking by Dude Love carried this, and Austin's timing was good as well. The highlight was Dude's selling of some great clotheslines in the ring, and crazy bumps out of it. They brawled all over the place including on the musical stage. Dude took a hip toss off the stage to the floor and Austin basically kicked him back into the ring. Dude took a hard clothesline bump on the floor and took a throat drop on the guardrail. Dude took a hard bump into the ring steps. At this point McMahon, Pat Patterson, and Gerald Briscoe came out with them giving McMahon a chair to sit at. McMahon made a look to timekeeper Mark Eaton and if to execute the plan. Austin saw McMahon at ringside and exploded. Austin attacked Dude including wrapping his knee around the post, but when he went for a piledriver on the floor, Dude reversed it into a backdrop and whipped him into the guardrail. McMahon taunted Austin, allowing Dude to attack Austin from behind and snapped his neck on the top rope. Austin came back and suplexed Dude on the ring steps. They continued to brawl on the floor until Austin threw Dude over the guardrail back to the ring area. At one point they teased the finish from the Blackman match on TV 1 week earlier as Dude had the abdominal stretch on and McMahon made eye contact with Eaton to ring the bell, but Eaton paused, theoretically afraid of Austin, and before McMahon could get the bell rung, Austin had reversed the move. Dude clotheslined the ref and used the mandible claw. Austin punched his way out, but Dude cut him off with a low blow and went back with the claw. Austin backdropped Dude over the top rope and while on the floor, Austin swung a chair at both Dude and McMahon with McMahon taking the hard shot. In the ring, Austin got away from the teased sweet chin music and hit the stunner and with no ref around, simply counted 1 2 3 for himself. Even though there was no ref, Austin's music simply played to signify the end of the stage play. They spent what appeared to be 15 minutes loading the unconscious McMahon, who appeared on television the next night not even selling an injury, to end the television show, but the announcement made as to the finish was that Austin was disqualified for hitting a WWF official. 4 stars. The first Pancrase pay-per-view show ever in Japan on April 26 came to an eventful conclusion with what was a first for pro wrestling on pay-per-view. Lions Den fighter Guy Mesger not only captured the King of Pancrase title, but also proposed to his girlfriend after the match. Mesger 30 joins Ken Shamrock and Frank Shamrock as the only fighters to have held both the King of Pancrase title and also captured championships in the Ultimate Fighting Championship by scoring an upset over COP champion Masakatsu Funaki on April 26 at Yokohama Bunka Gym before a sellout 5,600 fans. Funaki, reported to be entering the ring with a very bad cold which hurt his stamina, lost a unanimous decision after both men went 30 minutes with no points being scored. The only near finish of the match was apparently Funaki's cut, which was opened up in a 3:18 match against Semishield, being reopened and he was bleeding badly and at one point it was feared the doctor would have to stop the match. Mesger, who is 4-0 in UFC competition, was the winner of the under 200-pound tournament on its May 30, 1997 pay-per-view show from Augusta, Georgia. The belief appears to be that Mesger will defend the title at the Pancrase 5-year anniversary show on September 14 at Budokan Hall against Yuki Kondo. Pancrase is the closest thing to true legitimate sport that the pro wrestling world has had probably since the turn of the century. However, there are still aspects of working involved with pancrase such as a few worked matches, although a very small percentage fit into that category, and occasional business finishes, worked endings, and many, perhaps even most of the title changes may fit to an extent into that category. The vast majority of the matches are true competition, but toned down in a sense that there is a gentleman's agreement that even in this combative sport, to try and not hurt the opponent, and certain legal tactics, such as striking an opponent on the ground, are frowned upon in competition. We should have more of a report on the first pay-per-view show in next week's issue, but the show appeared to exemplify the problem of doing actual shooting matches within the context of pro wrestling once foes are up to speed on skill and knowledge. Of the 8 matches on the show, 6 went to the time limit without any points, for either knockdowns, yellow card cautions, or rope breaks, being scored and ended up in the hands of the judges. Although pancrase may be the highest level professional submission sport in the world, due to the competitors' knowledge of submissions, they are increasingly difficult to use, and there was only one submission, a surprise with Ryushi Yanagisawa beating Jason DeLucia with an ankle lock in 12:44, on the entire show. The other finish, Hatchel beat Jason Godzi in 1:47 when Hatchel got Godzi hard with a knee to the temple which busted his head badly, and the doctor stopped the match. This was a major week when it came to mainstream coverage of pro wrestling. Much of it was built around either the Ric Flair lawsuit or the On special on pro wrestling. Perhaps as important, simply because it was in the Wall Street Journal on April 28, was a story about pro wrestling advertising. In addition, Access Hollywood did a puff piece on Steve Austin on April 24, and Entertainment Tonight was scheduled for a piece on Nitro on April 28. The Today Show piece on Robbie Ellis, scheduled for April 24, was moved to some time in May to take advantage of sweeps. Another program, a Fox show called Lie Detector which stars Marcia Clark, had Lou Albano scheduled as a guest on its May 5 to be given a lie detector test when asked if pro wrestling was real, which sounds like one incredibly lame show just because the idea of it even possibly being real is outdated, and choosing an idiot like Albano, who in his day was a hilarious performer when kept within the wrestling world and fair as an actor, but has always embarrassed himself and the business whenever he's been a guest trying to defend pro wrestling, only makes the show more of a joke. Among Albano's noteworthy appearances in this vein was an edition of Nightline where he admitted that some of Pro Wrestling Today was worked, but that in the days of Roddy Piper and Bruno Sammartino it was real, and making a fool of himself at debate on a national sports show trying to defend pro wrestling against Jeff Blatnick by claiming that not only was pro wrestling real, but that King Kong Bundy would destroy Blatnick, who at the time was coming off winning an Olympic gold medal in a legitimate wrestling match. The Wall Street Journal piece was a positive as it positioned pro wrestling as one of Eric Bischoff's most successful marketing ploys, as being a hot item on college campuses, thus removing some of its tarnish as a fake sport designed as trashy entertainment to people of lower socioeconomic standing. The article, similar to an advertising age piece recently, noted that such advertising heavyweights as Sony, MCI, and Coca-Cola and Gillette are either advertising or getting into advertising on pro wrestling shows. The story noted that WCW ad rates per capita for the same-sized audience among teenagers and young adults as Monday Night Football are less than 13 cents on the dollar, $25 per 1,000 viewer in those demo groups delivered, as compared to more than $200 for football. The story claimed WCW ad rates have jumped 70% over the past 2 years, probably comparing figures before Nitro with those of today's weekly record-breaking ratings. It made a big deal out of the Harvard Lampoon Man of the Year award to Randy Savage, treating the spoof as something serious, to show that wrestling is a big deal among the highbrows at Harvard. The article also claimed wrestling has grown tamer and more soap opera-like, but also mentioned WWF likes to revel in a rebel image. We'll have a complete review next week of the On special on the history of pro wrestling. We've received tons of phone calls about the show, ranging from the gamut of people thinking it was really bad to really great. The show generally got good newspaper reviews, largely because it admitted from the start that pro wrestling was worked. Apparently, the more one is into historical accuracy, the less one liked the show, and it was virtually a unanimous complaint that they could do a 2-hour historical special on pro wrestling without one mention of the name Bruno Sammartino, and that Ric Flair wasn't given his proper due, and that the 80s were trivialized, largely built around a worked version of a backstory on the Hulk Hogan-Andre the Giant match, and the real 80s issues such as the deaths and the steroid problem were never addressed, and the real story of the past decade, the wrestling war, was barely touched on. The truth is, in a special like that, to those who frame the story in a sport without history, they are the ones who create the history, and the inaccuracies of the 80s stories may be no different from every other era touched upon. Still, we should have a lot to say about it next week. Now let's try and put some reality into the cold numbers and see what they really tell. When it comes to the United States, the comparisons between the two major companies are both interesting and somewhat misleading. When it comes to house shows, WWF has a lead in average attendance and a slight lead in average gate. But WCW sells out a greater percentage of its live events. Since WWF is playing generally larger buildings, it has the chance to draw more fans and bigger gates. Given that the difference in actual gates is almost negligible and WCW is running smaller buildings and also books generally fewer wrestlers on its house shows, although runs more television tapings where it books more wrestlers, so this gets tricky, WCW may be more profitable when it comes to running house show business. Since we don't have comparative advertising budgets, that can't be stated as an absolute either. But it isn't misleading to say both companies are doing record arena business, are greatly increasing their television audiences, and doing record pay-per-view business all at the same time. When it comes to comparing TV ratings, WCW has an artificial advantage because it is doing 2 live primetime shows per week and 1 weekend show that is secondary in nature, while WWF does 1 primetime show per week, which half the time isn't live, although the taped episodes draw the same ratings as the live ones, and 2 secondary weekend shows with little in the way of significant first-run material. Still, the Monday night head-to-head comparisons, which WCW has 1 every week but 1, are not misleading to compare, if anything, due to USA staggering the time slots so the show also airs in prime time on the West Coast and WCW have a replay show later that night. WWF has a significant artificial advantage, so WCW is decidedly the leader in television. In pay-per-view, the WWF's edge is largely due to WrestleMania being such a resounding success. One would figure WWF's normal level of business for the rest of the year will wind up with an average buy rate quite a bit lower than $1.26 and $5,450,000 per show, so the pay-per-view figures are going to wind up a lot closer at the end of the year. For the first quarter as compared with last year, WWF is up 60% in attendance while WCW is up 59%. WCW's gate increase would be more significant than WWF because it has increased its ticket prices at a faster rate. Since both groups' attendance has increased at about the same level but WCW has increased ticket prices much more, it confirms the theory that wrestling tickets, like most sports tickets, are not overpriced. WCW went for an average ticket price of $12.32 at this point last year to $18.88 while still increasing attendance 59%. Comparing ratings from the previous year has flaws because WCW dropped its 2 lowest rated hours and replaced them with a Thursday night weekly prime-time show, although the Nitro ratings are up significantly this year. Comparing WWF ratings also has flaws because in early 1997, WWF had a low-rated cable show which they dropped after that year's WrestleMania, but the monthly ratings comparisons for WWF the rest of the year would be like comparing apples to apples. The buy rate figures for WWF are misleading due to Mania, but with the in-your houses going from $19.95 to $29.95 and Mania from $29.95 to $34.95. Overall revenue from pay-per-view is going to be way up this year even if buy rates stay the same, and all indications are that they'll increase. WCW pay-per-view revenue has doubled this year from a combination of a lot more buys and a smaller increase in price. The basic feeling is that while the American business is through the roof, Japanese business is on its way down. Generally speaking, that would be accurate for the industry as a whole, but All Japan and New Japan aren't suffering as much as people think. Both for economic reasons, the Japanese economy is in the midst of a huge recession, and reasons having to do with oversaturation due to so many different wrestling promotions. The smaller groups are almost all in a lot of trouble in Japan. What is interesting is that All Japan, as stale as it is actually drawing more fans per show and selling out a higher percentage of its events than it has in previous years. That isn't to say the warning signs shouldn't be heeded because of the 4 biggest groups. All Japan has the least bright future due to the physical pounding its stars take and the fact there are no replacements on the horizon. Even TV ratings, while down from last year's big levels, are still ahead of what they were in previous years. While New Japan has declined slightly from 2 years back when it comes to average house show business, that also is misleading because we aren't factoring the 2 Tokyo Dome shows into the equation. Those shows were resounding successes, 2 of the biggest money shows in history, so overall New Japan is taking in more money over the first few months of the year than any time in its history. Of course, the big shows that make this the case were historical hotshot events, the retirements of Riki Choshu and Antonio Inoki. The success of those shows isn't indicative of a record-breaking interest level in the current New Japan product. The house show average attendance is a better indication where the product itself is, but not of the economic state of the company. But even comparing that, the house shows are along the same lines as they've been over the past 4 years, with a slight decline from the 1996 peak period. However, television ratings are ahead of what they've been in previous years since New Japan was banished to past midnight, although both groups have declined from 1997 peak levels when it comes to television ratings, All Japan dropping 12% and New Japan 22%, which is not a good sign for the future. Japanese television rundown. 3-1 Pancrase. 1. Kusei Kubota beat Hagar Chen in 6:48 with a reverse armbar submission. Chen is a former student of Ken Shamrock's. 2. Takafumi Ito beat Kim Jong-wan in 2:06 when both were going for an ankle and Ito got it good first. 3. Katsumi Inagaki and Takaku Fuke went to a draw over 10 minutes and another 3 minutes overtime. It was a pretty even match. 4. Jason DeLucia beat Satoshi Hasegawa in just 55 seconds when he hit him with a palm shot and busted his eye open and the doctor stopped the match. 5. Kyuma Kunyoku beat Asami Shibuya by decision after 20 minutes. Neither man came close to finishing the other. It was a very even match and probably should have been a draw. 6. Keiichiro Yamamiya beat Minoru Suzuki via decision after 20 minutes. Yamamiya had quicker hands and did better standing, but since most of the match was on the mat and Suzuki dominated it, Suzuki got a yellow card for taking off Yamamiya's knee pad. Most of the match saw Suzuki on top throwing lots of punches to Yamamiya's knee. After a stand-up about 18 minutes in, Yamamiya accidentally got a finger in Suzuki's eye but the ref didn't call a yellow card, which made no sense. Because of Suzuki getting the yellow card and no other points scored, Yamamiya got the decision even though Suzuki dominated. Suzuki didn't seem thrilled, considering he was the one poked in the eye and walked out rather than shaking Yamamiya's hand after the match, which is totally against the norm in this promotion. Except for the main event, this was a pretty uneventful show. 3-18 Pancrase. 1. Suzuki beat Kubota in 3:38 with a choke. Suzuki dominated the short match. Actually, Suzuki on this show was doing an old Antonio Inoki gimmick from about 10 years ago when Inoki lost a few matches. He said he was going to earn his main event spot by working his way up from the openers. 2. Justin McCulley drew Daisuke Ishii over 13 minutes. Ishii was an college all-star rugby player making his pro debut here. McCulley nailed him early with a kick to the head which opened a cut near the eye. The rest of the regulation and overtime was even and uneventful. Perhaps McCulley should have gotten the decision just based on the one kick, which was the only damaging blow of the match. 3. Inagaki beat Ito via 2-0 score after 10 minutes. Inagaki got 1 point for a knockdown from a kick and another for a rope break. Both showed a lot of quickness on the mat and it was a very good technical match. 4. Yoshiki Takahashi beat Leon Dake via unanimous decision after 10 minutes regulation and a 3 minutes overtime. Another good match. Takahashi even suplexed Dake at 1 point. Dake got some good palms and kick flurries, but Takahashi would then time him and take him down. It kept going this way through regulation. In the overtime, Takahashi again took him down, but Dake got in a lot of good blows from the bottom. Takahashi, when the decision was announced, almost seemed as if he didn't want to accept the win and refused to allow the ref to raise his hand. 5. Guy Mesger beat Rishi Yanagisawa via unanimous decision after 20 minutes in a match to determine who would get the next shot at Masakatsu Funaki on the pay-per-view show. This was totally one-sided as Mesger just dominated Yanagisawa on the mat the entire way, so it made for a boring match. He tried some submissions but never got any and there were no points scored, although Mesger was the easy winner. 6. Funaki beat Semi-Schultz via 1-0 score from a rope break after the 15 minutes time limit expired. Schultz, who is about a foot taller than Funaki, used his reach to throw some open hands that cut Funaki pretty bad alongside the eye. At one point they even stopped the match to have it examined, but the doctor ruled Funaki could continue. Virtually the entire match saw them on their feet and both being very cautious, with few blows thrown, mainly low kicks. Funaki finally took him down 6:46 in and got an over and under choke for a rope break at 8:25, which was the deciding point in the match. After the stand-up, the rest of the match consisted of them cautiously fighting on their feet with no telling blows being thrown by either man, although Funaki's cut was bleeding pretty bad as Schultz hit him with more open-handed shots. Another boring spectator match, even though Funaki was cut because it was mostly standing, circling and throwing cautious blows. 3:28 rings. 1. Valentin Overeem beat Kenichi Yamamoto in 6:36. Yamamoto formerly worked for UWFI and Pancrase, and did a lot of pro wrestling work both with New Japan and various indies as part of the Golden Cups trio. This was clearly a shoot match, and Overeem, who used his reach and striking skills, particularly throwing strong knees, to overpower him, had him by several inches and outweighed him 222 to 189. Overeem nailed Yamamoto with a knee on the ropes, which cut him. He did another front guillotine, and when Yamamoto slipped out, nailed him with another knee. At one point Overeem threw a kick that Yamamoto just ducked that probably would have kicked his head right off his shoulders. Yamamoto kept getting hit and was bleeding really bad, and they had the doctor examine Yamamoto. Yamamoto actually took Overeem down once, but Overeem, who was dominant by this point, scampered to the ropes for an escape point. Overeem ended up nailing Yamamoto with a hard knee to the chin, which knocked him out for a long time, and Yamamoto was carried out on a stretcher. Very brutal, exciting match. 2. Bob Gilstrap beat Grom Zaza by a 1-0 score after the two went the 30 minutes time limit in another shoot match. Gilstrap is a Maurice Smith student who apparently has had some training from Frank Shamrock, since they kept mentioning his name in the commentary, who has done NHB in both the US and Brazil, and is scheduled in the May 15th UFC. Zaza is a former Olympic wrestler who beat Ricardo Moraes in an NHB match in rings in September. The entire match consisted of Zaza, who had a 242 to 214 weight edge, continually taking Gilstrap down. He tried some rudimentary submissions but never came close to finishing Gilstrap. The point was from a very controversial yellow card as Zaza threw a closed fist punch to the head, but the punch didn't connect as Gilstrap moved, and that was the only point of the match. Without that, Zaza would have won the easy decision, but it was a pretty dull match. 3. Masayuki Naruse beat Sander Thanhauser in 10:37 of a really strange match. Thanhauser had some ground skill but was clearly more of a stand-up fighter. Every time Naruse would get him down, he'd go for the ropes to get the stand-up, giving up a lot of points that didn't appear to be necessary, but at the same time maybe he didn't have confidence in his ability to get off the bottom. The strategy worked, as at one point he kicked the hell out of Naruse and stunned him, and nearly got a choke, and Naruse went to the ropes and came out of the exchange with a bloody nose. As the match wore on, Thanhauser was noticeably tiring and twice held onto the ropes to avoid a takedown, which is also illegal, and got yellow cards for that, losing 2 more points. Naruse took him down and was going for a submission when Thanhauser grabbed the ropes for a break again, which was his 10th lost point, which automatically ended the match. Thanhauser didn't appear to understand the rules, and even though the score was 10-1, it was a pretty good match. 4. Ilyakine Mikhail beat Hiromitsu Kanehara in 14:03. Kanehara was formerly with UWFI and Kingdom, and in his first match with this group since the latter promotion folded. This was probably a worked match, although both men, and Kanehara in particular, were so good that you really had to pay very close attention to see any holes. It was a very good ring-style match, with Kanehara scoring with a lot of hard-sounding kicks and them trading submissions and rope breaks. The first knockdown by Kanehara looked great, but the second one was kind of weak. Right after being knocked down, Mikhail came back with a heel hook for the win. 5. Tsuyoshi Kosaka beat Nikolai Zuev in 10:20. This was another worked match, but also a very good one, as they traded cool-looking submissions. Zuev was made to look credible, and Kosaka got some pretty offense in, including a spectacular-looking flying armbar before winning with a heel hook. 6. Kiyoshi Tamura beat Dick Frey in 7:46. Frey looked like almost a different person than in his match with Paul Verlins. In the Verlins match, he was 255 and looked juiced to the gills. In this one he was 235 and soft-looking. But even though he looked a lot less menacing, at least he had some stamina. Since it was the main event, it was worked. Rings almost always works the main event match, at least on its big shows, because shoots are unpredictable when it comes to quality, and Tamura, who at 196 was the heaviest he's been since debuting in ring, that work is usually a good bet for a good bout. Even though it was worked, Tamura took some hard knees to make it look good. At one point Frey really rocked him, and even though Tamura didn't sell it by going down, you could see he was knocked a little silly. They did an interesting finish playing off the Peter Sakata match in Holland, where Tamura got a choke and Frey broke it by raking his eyes. Frey got a yellow card, and he didn't do a pro wrestling eye rake because Tamura's eye started swelling and tearing immediately. Tamura then got mad and got a strong takedown and an immediate choke for the win. It was okay, but not on the level of Tamura's usual matches. Michinoku Pro, not sure of date. 1. Men's Teo and Gran Hamada and Shoichi Funaki beat Grand Naniwa and Super Delphin and Tiger Mask in 1847. It was the typical fast-paced match, but it was a lot sloppier than usual, with the likes of Sasuke, Taka and Dick Togo removed from the equation. All kinds of big moves, and these guys cut a hot pace, but they were missing a lot. Built into the same usual match with the near falls and the dives, getting pretty exciting at the finish. It wound up with Teo pinning Naniwa after a powerbomb into the turnbuckles and a choke slam. 2.5 stars. 2. Hayabusa and Jinsei Shinzaki beat Mr. Ganasuke and Yukihiro Kanemura in 1910. Ganasuke and Kanemura, who are part of the FMW Briefs Brothers gimmick, are billed as Team No Respect, doing a gimmick similar to DX, but a more low-rent version. Kanemura at one point came off the top rope with a plancha, sending Shinzaki through a table. Ganasuke broke a stick and jabbed it into Shinzaki's face, and he bled. Kanemura and Ganasuke did a regular spot now where their foe is down and they kiss each other on the lips and deliver an elbow drop. Hayabusa tagged in with hard table shots and a running flip dive on Kanemura, and it ended with Hayabusa pinning Kanemura with a senton off the top rope. 2.25 stars. 3. Yoshihiro Tajiri and Teo and Funaki beat Naohiro Hoshikawa and Hamada and Masato Yakashiji in 1728. This was the hottest match on the TV, with them doing the expected Michinoku 6-man and it being only a level down from the regular match. Tajiri and Yakashiji are really hot workers. They finished the match up copying all kinds of US finishing spots, such as the Hurricane Rana stopped in mid-move into a Lion Tamer, the Rings of Saturn and a Diamond Cutter before Funaki used a heel hook submission on Yakashiji. 3.75 stars. 4. Super Delphin and Hayabusa beat Tiger Mask and Naniwa in 1956. The first part of the match was a real struggle, as these are both flyers rather than bases. There were all the big flying moves, but a lot of missed moves in the ring for that reason. Tiger looked bad and nobody seemed to have a grasp of how to turn this into a match. Then about midway through they figured it out and the second half of the match was really good. Delphin did a DDT on Naniwa, who was on Hayabusa's shoulders a la Steiner Brothers. All kinds of good near falls, dives and saves, and the match built. Delphin ended up pinning Tiger with a German suplex and then rolling back over him into a bridging backwards cradle, which was his old monkey special in his days as Monkey Magic Wakita in the early 90s. 3.25 stars. April 19th, All Japan. 1. Mitsuharu Misawa beat Jun Akiyama in 22:05 to win the Champion Carnival tournament. The match was slow-paced early. Due to Misawa's injuries, Akiyama really made the match, and Misawa was limited to very few big offensive moves and mainly used psychology of selling the knee to make it through the match. Fortunately, Akiyama was great here, although with Misawa limited it wasn't as good as many of their matches of the past. The match picked up and turned into a great match. Misawa got near falls and near submissions until Akiyama did the old Dick Murdoch calf branding, driving knee off the top, but instead onto Misawa's face, and then used a double arm pile driver and an elbow off the top for a near fall. Akiyama then did a move that started like a power bomb and turned into a hot shot, followed by a German suplex, a dropkick to the knee and an exploder, one right after the other. He used a flying knee to the face off the top, followed by an exploder for another near fall. Akiyama then ran into an elbow, and Misawa hit 2 German suplexes and a tiger suplex for near falls, but Akiyama came back with a brainbuster and another exploder for a near fall. Misawa then came back with 3 hard elbows, a rolling kick, a tiger driver, and finished off Akiyama with a running elbow to the face. 3.75 stars. Mexico. The biggest news is the apparent signing of what would be the biggest singles match of the year in Mexico, a mask versus mask match with La Parka versus Pierroth Jr. for July 20th in Nuevo Laredo, which one would figure would be won by Parka. There are serious negotiations going on for a Promo Azteca versus EMLL promotional feud angle that would result in a series of major matches at Arena Mexico, which has been drawing poorly all year. Antonio Pena has now filed 2 more lawsuits, one against Dionisio Castellano, Psicosis in WCW, claiming that Pena owned the marketing rights to that name. He has another wrestler, Leon Negro from Tijuana, working as Psicosis in his promotion right now. Psicosis no-showed the first court date, and if he does so again, he'll get a default ruling against him, which would mean he'll have to change his ring name not only in Mexico but also in the United States. The other is against Conan for defamation of character based on an interview in a magazine. April 24th at Arena Mexico was headlined by a hair versus hair match where Gran Marcus Jr. beat Brazo de Oro. The other top matches were Rayo de Jalisco Jr. and Headhunters versus Steel Valvinus, and CN Cars and Dr. Wagner Jr. and Atlantis and Negro Casas and Mr. Niebla versus El Hijo del Santo and Blue Panther and Black Warrior. The main event on April 21st at Arena Coliseo had Felino defending his NWA welterweight title against Karloff Lagarde Jr. Biggest Azteca show of the week was April 24th in Cuernavaca with Conan and Mascara Sagrada and Tarzan Boy versus Pierroth and Pirata Morgan and Super Crazy, Los Villanos vs El Brazo and Brazo Cibernetico and Brazo de Platino, Venom Black and Oro Jr. and Torero vs Mosco de la Merced and Pantera del Ring and Urasico and Super Muñeco and Super Parca and Antifaz del Norte vs Damien and Halloween and El Hijo del Diablo. There will be 2 major shows this coming week at the Auditorio in Tijuana. On May 1st, Promociones de Mora is running with Mil Mascaras and Tinieblas Jr. vs Los Hermanos Dinamita in what should be an all-time classic stinker. Plus in a Tijuana vs Mexico City it's Rey Mysterio and Kiss and Charisma and Psicosis vs Pierroth Jr. and El Satanico and Los Villanos 3 and 5. CMLL runs the same building on May 3rd with Headhunters and Emilio Charles Jr. vs Dr. Wagner Jr. and Apollo Dantes and Satanico and Rayo de Jalisco Jr. and Atlantis and Brazo de Plata vs Los Hermanos Dinamita. All Japan. Basically a quiet week leading up to the Tokyo Dome show on May 1st. Reports we've received are that as of about 1 week ago, about 30,000 tickets had been sold. The event itself is already more than profitable, but to be considered as a public success they probably have to get around 50,000 into the building. In Japan, the interest level for this show pales in comparison to the New Japan show in the same building a few weeks back. Apparently Johnny Ace, who was at the beginning doing the negotiations for this company in the original meetings with WWF, didn't even know about the deal made between Giant Baba and Victor Quiñones to get Vader on the Dome show until he arrived in Japan for the Carnival Tour, so in a symbolic way it was kind of a slap in the face to him. April 12th TV did a 3.8 rating. New Japan. Antonio Inoki had his retirement party on April 27th and spoke about his new United Fighting Organization, UFO, which will be positioned as a heel shooter group to feud with New Japan. Inoki didn't say much aside from already well-known names like Satoru Sayama, Naoya Ogawa, and Yoji Anjo. Other names floated around as possibilities have included New Japan wrestlers Kazuo Yamazaki and Kazuyuki Fujita, both of whom were in the Inoki tournament, along with Gran Hamada, who strongly denied it when his name made the papers. Don Frye, Rafael Kubatuki, 1993 World Judo Champion who was a major rival of Ogawa's when both were world-class heavyweights in that sport. Igor Mindert, Russian amateur wrestler who worked the Tokyo Dome, an early 40-ish Gerard Gordeau, karate legend from Holland, and 54-year-old Tiger Jeet Singh, Inoki's biggest rival in the mid-70s. More than 1,000 people attended Inoki's retirement party at the Tokyo Anazeniku Hotel. New Japan finished an uneventful tour of the island of Kyushu on April 26th with a show in Hakata. Genichiro Tenryu was brought in as the top attraction with Keiji Muto out of action due to surgery on both knees. Tenryu worked in 10 tag matches, winning 9, to elevate Heisei Ishgun in its war with both NWO Japan and New Japan. The only loss was April 21st in Ube when Tenryu and Shiro Koshinaka and Michiyoshi Ohara lost the main event to Masahiro Chono and Hiro Saito and Hiroyoshi Tenzan. NWO Japan is more and more sliding into Aristrist, as Tenzan is the only Japanese member still wearing the NWO t-shirt and Chono gave TV announcer Tsuji an Aristrist medallion to wear. The Tatsumi Fujinami vs Shinya Hashimoto IWGP title match for June 5th at Budokan Hall was announced this week. That card will also feature the finals of the Super Junior tournament and the finals of the tournament to determine the vacant IWGP Tag Team Champions. April 11th TV did a 1.6 rating. Other Japan notes. On the same night as the Pancrase show in Yokohama, Shootboxing also put on a show in the same city, at the larger Yokohama Arena. The announced attendance was 12,000, although that was probably heavily papered and exaggerated since they only had 2,000 tickets sold a few days before the event. In a Valley Tudo rules match, Emmanuel Yarbrough, the 6'8", 640-pounder best known in the US for being knocked down by Keith Hackney at UFC 3, squashed 210-pound pro wrestler Tatsuo Nakano in 1:17. Apparently Yarbrough wound up on top, and Nakano was literally suffocating under so much weight with no way out and tapped. In Shudo matches, Matt Rocca, a former Lions Den fighter, lost to Akira Gono in 3:12, and Ruben Asado, the star of Shudo, increased his record to 12-1-1 beating Michael Buell, a former lightweight champion for the USWF, in just 31 seconds with an armbar. The May 24th K1 show in Fukuoka has already sold out with no matches announced. Speaking of K1, it was officially sanctioned by the Nevada State Athletic Commission this past week, so its debut in the US will be on August 9th at the Mirage Hotel in Las Vegas. Draka, which was also set for a presentation, canceled its presentation to get sanctioned in Nevada and apparently has some major financial problems, which I guess happens when you have main eventers earning $95,000 for a match and you're drawing 1,500 fans to live shows with no pay-per-view or TV money coming in. Rings ran April 25th in Ekaterinburg, Russia before a sellout 7,000. With Kiyoshi Tamura out of action with injuries suffered in the Valentin Overeem match 1 week earlier, Akira Maeda, who wasn't scheduled on the show, worked the main event beating Nikolai Zuev in 3:53. The top Russian star for the group, Volkan, beat Dick Frey from Holland in 4:21. Maeda was going to Russia in part to try and negotiate with Alexander Karelin to be his final opponent, however no meeting took place. Tsuyoshi Kosaka didn't do the show either, and the fact he wasn't put in as a replacement may lend credibility to the idea he's less than 100%, which is why he's out of UFC. Yoshihiro Tajiri quit Big Japan over money and will apparently return to Mexico. Neo Ladies top star Kyoko Inoue captured the TWF Women's title, the top title of the JD office, on April 26 at Korakuen Hall before an announced sellout of 2,050, beating Lioness Asuka. Zap T. Tomoko Watanabe won the All-Pacific title for AJW, beating Takako Inoue for the belt on April 21 in Osaka. Koji Kiao will be working the May 1 Big Japan show. Apparently this is some sort of weird deal in that he was originally booked for Baba's Dome show, but Baba cancelled it when, apparently, Kiao didn't want to do a job for Akira Taue, and so he's working a rival show on the same day. Here and there. We don't have details on the second Memphis television show, but as fate, or something else, would have it, Austin Idol no-showed his scheduled TV main event against Bill Dundee, and also no-showed a similar match for a house show that night in Crenshaw, Mississippi. Just last week on TV, Jerry Lawler joked as an angle that Randy Hales should have never booked Idol because he's no-showed so many promoters. On the April 18th Memphis show, the Lawler vs. Bill Dundee match was billed as their final match ever, but with Idol missing Crenshaw, the main event ended up being Lawler vs. Dundee. It was explained that it was being made a non-sanctioned match so that their final match ever was the Memphis match. However, it ended in a no contest when Stacy and Samantha interfered. On April 26th in Garfield, New Jersey, Sid Vicious did a job for Rick Ratchet. The main event was billed as Sid vs. King Mabel, but Sid decided to change the card and put over Ratchet, who he's friends with, via pinfall after Ratchet hit him with Nux. After the match, Sid powerbombed about half the world, including Ratchet. So while it's a job and it's a loss in a business where wins and losses means nothing, it's not a job in the traditional sense of putting somebody over to get them, and not yourself, over, for the good of business. Jake Roberts wrestled on April 25th in Ashford, Kent, England for Hammerlock Promotions. Luke McMasters, better known as such names as Giant Haystacks in England and the Loch Ness Monster in Calgary in WCW, has gotten a clean bill of health after an 18-month battle with cancer which was considered life-threatening. McMasters, 55, who worked in WCW in 1986, lost 350 pounds in the battle against cancer. Former WCW television announcer Chris Cruz is now working as the Top Heel manager for New Dimension Wrestling in the Carolinas, and apparently gets, if anything, too much heat. Over the weekend, Cruz managed Giant Kimala 2 from All Japan in matches against Rick Link, and on May 2nd in Lexington, North Carolina, will manage Iron Sheik against Link. Music City Wrestling will be presenting an NWA 50th anniversary show on June 6th in Nashville, where fans are supposed to vote for who the greatest NWA champion of all time is. Scheduled to appear at the show are both Tully Blanchard and Harley Race. On April 18th, Jamie Dundee lost a Loser Leaves Town match to Flash Flanagan, and apparently is now wrestling in the area under a mask as El Diablo from Mexico. There will also be an NWA 50th anniversary weekend on October 23rd through October 25th in Philadelphia, with a Hall of Fame banquet and a card featuring wrestlers from all 20 NWA promotions. Century Wrestling Alliance on May 9th in Somerville, Massachusetts has Tony Atlas, King Kong Bundy, Tony Rumble, Vic Steamboat, Devon Storm, and Ace Darling. A company called Checkered Flag Productions drew 1,263 fans to an indie show on April 25th in Wichita Falls, Texas, using Chris Adams, Greg Valentine, Mondo, and a Hector Guerrero, Jim Powers, Terry Gordy, Bill Irwin, Black Bart, and King Parsons. Libnan Ayub, whose father was a pro wrestler, wrote a book called 100 Years of Australian Professional Wrestling, covering wrestling in that country from 1880 to 1978. The book was released on April 16th with a match deal in Sydney which included Mario Milano, who was at one time the biggest wrestling star in the country, Ron Miller, who won a famous non-title match over Harley Race in 1978, George Barnes, who wrestled a few tours of Memphis and was the original tag team partner of Bill Dundee in that area, among countless others. Former wrestling promoter Ben Masters, who had a farewell show some time back, is doing another show on June 13th at the National Guard Armory in Cordell, Georgia, with Abdullah the Butcher in a battle royal, Terry Gordy vs. Mike Golden, R.D. Swain vs. Doug Gilbert, Willie Black vs. Richard Slinger, and the retirement match of Ted Oates against Dutch Mantle. Apparently that match has some significance because Oates' first pro match was in 1972 against Wayne Keown, who is the real name and first ring name of Dutch Mantle, in Americus, Georgia. If you mention the Observer, you can get $1 off any ticket by calling 912-472-7263. You'll love this one. On April 28th in Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, a wrestler from Clark Summit, Pennsylvania named Tiny went on a rampage, dressed up like a cow, smashed his car into a house, and it took 20 state troopers to subdue him. It's not the first time he's done something like this. Independent wrestler Flex Wheeler of the Grand Wrestling Alliance in Philadelphia is doing a boxer versus wrestler gimmick against NAP and USBA middleweight boxing champion Tony Martin, who once fought Julio Cesar Chavez, losing by a close decision on May 2nd at the Salvation Army on Broad Street. NHB. There is virtually nothing substantive to report on the May 15th UFC pay-per-view show, which is now just weeks away. About the only matches on the show that look to be definites are a first-round tournament match with Bob Gilstrap versus Carlos Newton, and a singles match with Tank Abbott versus Hugo Duarte. Everything else is up in the air, and Bob Marowitz and David Isaacs were in Brazil this past week negotiating to put together a deal to hold a live UFC event in that country before the end of the year. Here is how everything else appears to stand at press time. John Peretti wanted to put Mark Coleman against Francisco Bueno, a Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt who apparently has never had an NHB match but did well in the recent All Submissions tournament in Abu Dhabi. However, Bueno doesn't appear to want that match. Peretti didn't want to change his brainchild of a Mike Van Arsdale versus Regan Machado match that hadn't been signed. However, there were people leaning toward Coleman versus Machado. However, Coleman wants more money for such a match. Pete Williams of Lions Den has also been a name thrown around in regards to a match perhaps with Van Arsdale. Both Tsuyoshi Kosaka and Vitor Belfort appear to be off the show for sure, Kosaka due to rings claiming he's suffering from dizziness, and Belfort because the sides can't come to money terms. There is nothing definite regarding a Frank Shamrock match to be on the live card and taped as a main event for an otherwise highlight show on pay-per-view in July. The idea was to put Shamrock against Enson Inoue in a rematch of their November match in Japan that had probably the most exciting finish in the recent history of NHB. However, Inoue was up to 220 pounds when contacted and felt with this little time, he didn't want to drop to 199, so other plans are being discussed. The other tournament scheduled first-round match was Alan Goes versus Dan Henderson, but no word on that one since Henderson was injured on April 25th at the Wrestling Nationals. We don't have a report on exactly what the injury was, but he had to forfeit in the tournament, which he was the favorite going in. There was an NHB show on April 26th in Sao Paulo, Brazil, with Gary Myers versus Khalid Ismail as the main event, a match more interesting due to the size difference as Ismail usually fights at 176 and Myers at around 230. By pre-match deal, Myers was to come in at 199 and he basically starved himself to make weight. When he got there, he weighed in a few pounds heavy, worked the weight off, weighed in at 199. And left to eat his first meal in days. When he got back, they told him there was something wrong with the first weigh-in and they'd have to do it again, and by this time he was 207, so he had to sweat the weight back off again. When the match took place, it went 30 minutes with Myers having no energy and Ismail winning a clear decision, although Ismail himself was frustrated at his inability to hurt a gassed-out bigger guy and said he no longer wants to fight anyone outside his weight class. Several wrestlers who have done well in NHB were part of the U.S. National Wrestling Championships on April 25th and April 26th in Lake Buena Vista, Florida. In what is almost always the feature match in national competition, defending world champion Leigh Gutches at 187 beat Kevin Jackson 4-0 in the finals at Freestyle. In a big upset, Tom Erickson was pinned in 20 seconds by Tolly Thompson in the 286-pound finals. Van Arsdale, a few weeks before his planned UFC debut, went to the finals at 214, losing to Melvin Douglas by criteria decision after they had fought to a 0-0 score after overtime. On the Greco-Roman side, both Dennis Hall, 128, and Matt Lindland 168 won championships while Henderson, 187, was injured and couldn't continue. Perhaps the most interesting result was in freestyle at 168 where four-time NCAA champion Pat Smith faced longtime rival Sean Bourmet. Bourmet, who is now doing NHB with the Raw team, lost his temper in the match and punched Smith in the face, getting disqualified, resulting in the closest thing amateur wrestling has to a bench-clearing brawl. We don't have details on this, but apparently over the weekend in Guam, Dan Severn headlined another NHB show and won to up his record to 23-2. ECW. Shane Douglas had yet another escapade this week and was hospitalized overnight on April 24th. Douglas didn't have surgery this past week from the broken bone in the roof of his mouth, but was warned not to fly. He disregarded the advice, figuring that a Pittsburgh to Philadelphia flight was a short flight at a low altitude, and midway through the flight his sinuses exploded and he was bleeding all over the place and rushed to the hospital. He was released the next day and went to Trenton, New Jersey for the ECW show on April 25th, although he didn't work. Those who saw him backstage said he looked like a guy with a 110-degree temperature, like a dead man, and looked considerably worse than any wrestler ever backstage at an ECW show, and you can imagine what that takes in. At press time the plan was somehow for Douglas to drive to Marietta since he can't fly for the pay-per-view on May 3rd and do whatever he can do in regard to a match with Al Snow, although Paul Heyman did say that due to this latest mishap there is a chance Douglas won't be able to wrestle. Taz, who had his own problems last week, was backstage limping badly this weekend and will be on the pay-per-view show doing at least an angle or interview, but won't be wrestling. As it turns out, Taz wasn't injured doing the table spot, as when the table spot aired on television it was clear Taz's leg wasn't cut. Apparently it was later in the same angle as he jumped from the apron to the floor somehow a piece of metal behind ring banners sliced his calf muscle like a shark bite. Between those two and Sandman being out, which is more selling an angle although he's beat up as well, it was a limited crew on the weekend shows, although both April 24th in Woodbridge, New Jersey and April 25th in Trenton, New Jersey sold out to the tune of 1,100 and 1,400 respectively. The shows were also said to be two of the better spot shows of the year, in particular a great match with Rob Van Dam versus Jerry Lynn the first night and a good match with Snow versus Chris Condito the second night. A correction from last week. While ECW will be releasing an entrance music CD, they aren't going to drop using pop tunes as entrance music, as they are trying to get a local band do remakes of the tunes as entrance music similar to the music Taz at this point and Rick Rude, when he worked here, had. Tommy Rogers should be back at the end of May. The next New England tour is July 10th in Worcester at the Palladium, July 11th in Manchester, New Hampshire at JFK Coliseum, and July 12th in Revere, Massachusetts. The debut show in Cleveland is May 22nd, and on July 4th, they'll be doing an outdoor show on the beach in Wildwood, New Jersey. Atsushi Onita will be coming here on June 26th to discuss plans for doing an explosive bomb match during the summer. WCW. Nitro on April 27th in Norfolk opened with the return of Alex Wright as he was dancing with the Nitro girls and got taken away by security. He'll probably be back in the ring in a few weeks. Kevin Nash and Randy Savage did an interview where Nash accepted Sting's challenge for a tag title match. They said they were forming their own group called the Wolfpack and introduced Conan as the third member and said more were to come. Scott Hall is scheduled to return on the May 4th Nitro. Chris Jericho retained the Cruiserweight title, beating Chavo Guerrero Jr. with the Lion Tamer in 156. Jericho and Eddie Guerrero had a small nose-to-nose as there was a spot where they collided during the match. Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff did an interview. Bill Goldberg retained the U.S. title, beating Scott Norton in 245 in a match a lot better than you'd think. The first hour ended with Bret Hart doing easily his best interview since coming to WCW, saying he wanted to tell Hogan to his face why he did what he did. At this point, for whatever reason, there was about a 30-minute delay between the end of the first hour and the beginning of taping the second show. After just dead time live, they sent out Diamond Dallas Page to beat Barbarian and Johnny Grunge to beat Hugh Morris before starting the Tuesday show. That opened with Chris Benoit over Disco Inferno in 5:18 of the best match on either show. Jericho came out, walking to the ring like he was Dean Malenko, to Malenko's music, and beat Psychosis in 5:09 to keep the title. Some good moves and some sloppy ones, but the finish was really messed up. Morris and Barbarian beat Public Enemy in 4:34 when Barbarian pinned Grunge with a kick to the face. Real bad. Juventud Guerrera pinned Billy Kidman in 3:52 with a 450 in a good match. Okerlund interviewed Alex Wright. Not much of an interview. He said he'd been on vacation. Booker T kept the TV title, pinning Eddie Guerrero with a missile dropkick in 4:29. Some good stuff, but overall a disappointment. Eddie slapped Chavo after the match. Perry Saturn pinned Marty Jannetty with the Death Valley Driver in 2:13. No heat at all. Page challenged Raven to a match, but Sick Boy and Kidman came out and said Raven wasn't there but had a video. Live it took forever because I guess the last match put everyone to sleep in the control room. Luckily it was re-edited for TV, but the segment was still flat. Page used a diamond cutter on Sick Boy when yet another fan, Mortis, hit the ring and clotheslined Kidman over the top rope, and security handcuffed him. Yeah, doing the clothesline over the top spot really made this shoot angle look realistic. Goldberg destroyed Jerry Flynn in 48 seconds. Sting and Giant and Lex Luger beat Scott Steiner and Conan and Bryan Adams in 6:36. Let's see, Conan just left the NWO for Wolfpack but teamed with the other NWO members and there was no problems in the match. Well, problems working with the other guys. Anyway, Adams walked out on his partners, but then Conan and Steiner joined him and it was a count-out finish. Vincent hit the ring and was there all by himself and Giant choke slammed him. Sting then helped Vincent to his feet after the match. Just what Sting needs to make sure he digs himself out of this quagmire, forming a tag team with Vincent. Finally, the show ended with a Hart-Hogan confrontation. There was a real lack of heat for this segment. Hart said Hogan used to be someone he looked up to for a long time, said he was the highest paid and most recognized wrestler who ever lived. Just as Hart was about to tell Hogan why he made sure he won the title, Savage attacked Hart. This led to Hogan, Hart and Ed Leslie destroying Savage as the show went off the air. Savage has decided against having the knee surgery, which was scheduled for April 27. The company doctor said he's risking a situation where he may walk with a limp for the rest of his life. Among other injuries, Kurt Hennig re-injured his right knee and may need surgery. Rick Steiner is out of action with a shoulder injury. Scott Steiner injured his weakened back, the one he had surgery on in 1996, in the six-man at Nitro. Sting refused to turn heel, which was Hogan's idea since Hogan figures he needs a top guy to do tag matches with against Hall, Nash, Savage, etc. Sting probably didn't want to make the switch because it would kill his merchandise sales, although the marketing of the Goldberg stuff has resulted in that happening anyway. Thunder on April 22 in Columbia, South Carolina drew 6,646, paying $124,515. Because it was moved to Wednesday, the rating dropped to a 3.38 rating and 5.5 share for the live show and 1.57 rating and 5.7 share for the replay. Hogan had Ed Leslie spray paint the belt NWO. Bischoff brought up Hogan drawing the 6.5 rating in the final quarter on Monday. Booker T pinned Disco to keep the TV title in 5:44 of a good match. Barbarian pinned Prince Iaukea with a high kick in 2:22. In the commentary they seemed to be setting up Meng returning to feud with Barbarian and kept referring to Barbarian as the new Barbarian. Unfortunately, he's every bit as bad as the old one. Real bad match. Norton and Bagwell beat Rick Steiner and Luger in 5:40 in the match where Bagwell was injured. When Bagwell was finally removed, they debuted Horace Boulder against Evan Courageous. Fans were chanting boring 20 seconds into the match. It was boring and Boulder isn't any good, but the least they could have done was allowed him 1 minute to show that he isn't any good. Page did a run-in and hit the diamond cutter on Boulder for the DQ, then used it on Courageous. Savage did a totally incoherent interview which got no heat, trying to do shoot comments on Hart saying he's overpaid, unproven, and a mark for his own publicity. Goldberg pinned Mike Enos with the jackhammer in 2:01. Main event saw Sting beat Scott Steiner via DQ in 4:21 when Conan interfered for the DQ. The rest of the NWO came out. Rick Steiner chased Scott to the back. Giant showed up to help Sting clean house and Sting did an interview where he challenged Hall and Nash to a tag title match. This interview was even worse than Savage's, as Sting, after being jumped by a bunch of guys, challenged two guys that weren't there and the best reason he had for being mad at them is because Nash is really funny. There is some sort of a situation ongoing involving Mark Madden. Madden was dropped from all live broadcasts. He was doing some direct TV stuff during the commercial breaks on Nitro and also live internet play-by-play during the Nitros, PPVs and paper listens, after slamming down a headset while on a direct TV broadcast when there were some problems getting cues. He was told he would stay with the company doing his hotline messages, but a few days later was fired from that as well by Nick Lombros after doing a message that apparently put over the Click and Ric Flair. However, Bischoff may have interceded to save his hotline spot. Conan will be moving from Mexico City to Miami to cut down on his weekly travel, but still go to Mexico on occasion to handle front office work and wrestle. House shows for the week saw April 23rd in Asheville, North Carolina drew a sellout 6,269 and $116,585. April 24th in Florence, South Carolina drew 6,449 and $111,545. April 25th in Charlotte drew 7,704 and $135,175, and April 26th in Roanoke drew 7,561 and $151,670. Merchandise for the week was $337,694 or $7.75 per head. Interesting that the first full week of Goldberg merchandise, and the Goldberg merchandise has already become the big seller, the actual average per head is way down because for whatever reason the Sting and other stuff has plummeted. Main events were Sting vs. Nash at all the house shows. In Asheville, Sting won via DQ due to outside interference, but Nash stopped Scott Steiner and Scott Norton from attacking Sting, saying that his problems are with Hogan, not Sting. In Charlotte, they did a DQ finish which wound up with an impromptu tag match with Sting and Luger beating Nash and Norton. When Norton did the job, continued to beat Raw head-to-head in England on March 20th and 3/27 by a 53-47 market share edge, making it 4 weeks in a row that Nitro has won since the two shows started going head-to-head in England. WCW Saturday Night on April 25th did a 2.0 rating. WWF. Some notes on the tapings: April 27th in Hampton, Virginia and April 28th in Richmond, Virginia. In Hampton, Adam Copeland got a tryout as a heel, beating Darren Drostoff with Jackal as Copeland's manager. Also getting tryouts were local wrestlers Timber the Lumberjack, who beat Mitchip, and Val Venus won a squash, while for Shotgun, Steve Blackman beat D'Lo Brown, Mark Merrow beat Ricky Morton, and LOD 2000 beat Jose and Jesus. The live show started with Ken Shamrock and Owen Hart versus the Nation of Domination. However, Hart turned on Shamrock and they stomped him around. This angle was done to give Hart a new angle since they kind of let him flounder as a face, and to explain Shamrock being gone since he's got the torn ligaments in his foot and is expected out of action for 4 to 8 weeks. Goodlove did the interview saying he should get a title shot at Austin. Headbangers beat Terry Funk and 2 Cold Scorpio in a match billed as the winner getting a tag title shot via DQ when Funk threw down the ref in 3:14. It was real bad and had no heat most of the way, until a series of dives with Funk doing a moonsault from the top rope to the floor, which is totally nuts. They continued to brawl after the match, with the Bangers doing the Power and Glory finish and Scorpio using a moonsault with some amazing hang time. Bradshaw beat Jeff Jarrett via DQ in 1:16. Wayne Club Kamikaze with manager Wally Yamaguchi under a mask all attacked Bradshaw, and Taka Michinoku did a run-in, but they did a number on him again. Because of the size difference, doing this program with Bradshaw looks totally stupid. Skull and 8-Ball beat Outlaws in a non-title match in 3:35 after a switch. Work was terrible. Actually, all the matches for the most part were bad with no heat unless Austin was involved, and all the interviews got good reactions. Undertaker destroyed an out-of-shape Barry Windham in 59 with a tombstone and challenged Kane to come out. Paul Bearer came out with Kane and revealed that Kane was actually his son. DX came out with Triple H challenging anyone in the back to come out. Dan Severn came out with Jim Cornette. Cornette tried to stop him from wrestling Triple H, but Severn instead destroyed Cornette with both an armbar and choke at the same time. Cornette sold it huge and didn't appear in front of the cameras at TV the next night either, so it appears it was a storyline reason to end him as a television character. Val Venus is still coming. Sable challenged Mark Merrow to a match on the May 11th Raw show. Finally, Austin and Goldust had their match, which ended when McMahon hit Briscoe with a chair. In Richmond for TV on May 4th and May 9th before a sellout crowd, it started with Copeland this time playing a geeky babyface role, beating Matt Hardy. Venus beat Drostoff. Venus got a big reaction coming out, but little once the bell sounded. At one point he put on a camel clutch and began humping Drostoff. Wellington Wilkins Jr., formerly of Michinoku Pro, got a tryout beating a masked executioner. He didn't look good at all. McMahon then introduced Steve Williams, who came out doing his Triangle of Power sign from All Japan, and he beat 2 Cold Scorpio with a backdrop driver. Williams looked bad, but he'll probably still get a push since they've been waiting forever to bring him in as a main event heel, and they're really weak on singles heels. Midnights without Cornette beat Bangers in a bad match. Kama and D'Lo beat Bob Starr and John Richland. Kama worked most of the match with a hat on, smoking a cigar and wearing sunglasses. Bad. Taka Michinoku beat David Jericho, Dave Cash, who they actually billed as Jericho. Real good match. Kamikaze and Yamaguchi did a run-in and attacked Taka until Bradshaw made the save. A Mexican wrestler without a mask billed as something close to a Jill Chula beat Scott Taylor in what was also a real good match, including some sort of amazing moonsault from the top rope over the guardrail. Taylor and Brian Christopher had good charisma together and are now called Too Hot and Too Sexy, the tag team of Too Much. Raw started with DX doing an interview and LOD and DOA challenged them to an 8-man. Chains was also not around. X-Pac called LOD douchebags. Hart did an interview saying his family deserted him, the fans in office didn't appreciate his talent, and that's why he turned on everyone. Hart and Maivia beat Blackman and Farouk when Jarrett caused Blackman to get pinned. Not good. They did a love shack, but Mick Foley came out as Mick Foley and complained about not being the #1 contender and challenged Funk to a Falls Count Anywhere match. He said he would never do the Dude Love character again and that he never wanted his wife and son to see him dancing around with strippers like he did the previous night. He threw the Dude Love outfit in McMahon's face. McMahon told him if he destroyed Funk that he could become the top contender and slapped him in the face. Austin ended up chasing McMahon all over the place and then destroyed the Love Shack set. Severn, who was a lot less over without Cornette, not that he was with him, beat Vega. Lawler interviewed Bearer, who said that when he was 19, he was a virgin stud and Undertaker's mom was scantily clad and seduced him on the kitchen floor. Goldust wrestled Kane, but Undertaker showed up and attacked Bearer and did a pull-apart with Kane. Outlaws and Triple H and Chyna beat LOD and DOA when LOD and DOA fought amongst themselves and brawled to the back. What a feud that's going to be. 4 guys who stand there and throw blows and never sell. Chyna tagged in once doing a Hurricane Rana on one of the DOAs. DX laughed at both teams afterwards. Jarrett was set to wrestle Mero, but Blackman attacked him before the match. Blackman was dragged away and they had a long boring singles match with no heat. Jarrett walked out for a count out. Jarrett then came back, and so did Blackman, and he and Blackman brawled to the back, and apparently it was ruled a count out again, so they may splice out the first ending that didn't get over and go with the second, that also wasn't any good. They brought out Hart and Maivia versus Blackman and Farouk, which was a quickie with Hart and Maivia walking out for a count out. They'll probably splice parts of this with their previous bout. Finally it was Mick Foley from East Setauket, New York against Funk with Pat Patterson as ref in Austin, drinking beer at ringside, doing color. They brawled all over the place. They did hard chair shots, including Foley bleeding from the back of his head. Funk moonsaulted Foley off a mezzanine. Foley pile drove Funk through a table. Lots of ECW chants. Foley suplexed a concession stand worker plant. They brawled to the back and came back in on the opposite side of the building. Funk kept kicking out of big moves until Foley pinned him after a pile driver on a chair. Funk kept beating on him until Austin hit the ring. Patterson tried to break it up, but Foley put the claw on him. Austin broke that up. Patterson grabbed a chair to hit Austin, but he moved and hit Foley. Austin used a stunner on Patterson. It ended with McMahon dancing to Dude's music with 2 strippers, and Foley came back out and McMahon gave him back his outfit and he danced around like Dude Love again with the strippers. Dark match had Austin, wearing jean shorts, and Undertaker and Farouk and Blackman over Maivia, who wore a Shamrock t-shirt, and Triple H and Kane and Jarrett. Undertaker and Kane left early, and it ended with Austin pinning Triple H with a stunner, and gave stunners after to Chyna, X-Pac, and Triple H again. Dory Funk held a training camp this week with Sola Fafatu, who is apparently going to return this summer as part of a Samoan gang with Semu, Matty and Lloyd Anoya, managed by Mick Tierney, Irish assassin from California, John Tenta, who will be a masked wrestler to feud with Austin Paul Silva, the 7'3", 485-pound former basketball player from Brazil who is a long way away from being ready to wrestle but can bench 400, which is amazing for someone with such long arms. Aaron O'Grady, who reportedly was the best wrestler in the camp, Vic Grimes and Sean Stasiak. Weekend house shows saw April 24th in Greenville, South Carolina draw a sellout 5,303 paying $109,626, and April 25th in Fayetteville, North Carolina drew 9,478 paying $160,754. With those 2 events and the Monday Raw taping, the merchandise was $202,022, not including Greensboro, which is $8.90 per head. Vince Russo appears to have taken over for Cornette as announcer for Shotgun. Don't know if this is related or not, but Dennis Brent was hired to run the magazine, which was what Russo was doing. Brent's wife Lynn worked as PR assistant for WCW and she resigned this week. Brent has been friends with Jim Ross dating back to the Mid-South days and used to do the WCW magazine before having a falling out with Sharon Seidello. Livewire on April 25th did a 1.2 rating and Superstars on April 26th did a 1.7. The Reader's Pages. Flair. The current story about Ric Flair's legal battle with Eric Bischoff and WCW reminded me of an old angle from the 80s involving the Four Horsemen. Ole Anderson missed some important match with the Horsemen and Tully Blanchard harshly criticized Anderson during an interview, saying Ole should be kicked out of the group for ignoring Horseman business in favor of attending an amateur wrestling meet featuring his young son. Pro wrestling angles that mirror real-life situations are old hat, but real-life conflicts that seem to be inspired by pro wrestling angles are still sort of unique. The part I remember best about the angle was an absolutely great promo by Ole where he swore that one day his snot-nosed kid, Blanchard's words, would grow up and kick Tully's ass. I'm sure, in retrospect, that Ole didn't use the term kick you ass. Sometimes it's hard to remember what language people used back in the old days when you couldn't say ass on television, not to mention that you couldn't expose your ass on television, point to it, discuss it ad nauseum, or use it as a ring name. Scott Cornish. New Hartford, New York. I was driving back to my office from court this morning and heard an advertisement for this coming weekend's WCW show in Greenville, South Carolina. WWF sold out a meat-sized arena in Greenville this past Friday evening. WCW is running the show at an outdoor baseball stadium. The double main event advertised, as has been the WCW main event on many of its record sellout streak, was Ric Flair versus Curt Hennig. Hasn't WCW ever heard of the term unfair and deceptive practices in trade or commerce? If they know that Flair won't be on the card but are continuing to advertise him, I can't understand why they would take such a liability risk. Charles Russell Burrell. Greenville, South Carolina. Response from Dave Meltzer, because it has become common business practice in pro wrestling and nobody ever calls them on it. Hall of Fame. I think Michael Hayes needs to be in. He was an innovative showman who influenced those who came after him. He was a key part of some great runs. By the same token, I don't see Barry Windham in. I want him to be in, but when you look at it objectively, he was never a crucial linchpin to the success of the areas he headlined. It's a tough call because of sentimental reasons you want certain people to be in, but what makes the Hall of Fame special is that not everyone can get in. The Captain Redneck litmus test is a brutal one. I say yes to Dos Caras. He's an incredible mat technician who is closing in on 3 decades in the game. Remember the second Super J Cup? Some of the greatest young flyers and wrestlers in the world were on the same card, and he was the guy who stole the show. Also yes to Gran Hamada for staying at the top of his game and hanging in with the younger guys for so long. Longevity and work ethic puts him in. I don't think Hiroshi Hase makes it, unless there is a special wing for selflessness. If there is, he's a first ballot pick. Cactus Jack. There should also be a Cactus Jack litmus test for heart for the other wrestlers to meet before they're allowed in. I'd vote no on Davey Boy Smith. The biggest argument in his favor was that he was part of a revolutionary tag team with Dynamite Kid. Unfortunately, not enough of an impact was made to put him in. As for Keiji Muto, I say wait. He's been too erratic to deserve consideration now, but time will tell. Same as Masahiro Chono, although I would be surprised if Chono doesn't eventually make it in. Lex Luger is a no. He's never been able to put it together. Same with Curt Hennig. Hennig is kind of like Akira Taue. There are lots of other guys around who could have played the same role as them. One of my favorite wrestlers is El Hijo del Santo. Could you explain his current status in Mexico, what forces brought it about, and what his future might hold? It seems like he's booked as a heel, except that everyone still cheers him. One thing I can't understand is how he, or his family, would allow him to be booked as anything other than face. I remember all the fuss about the Santo Negro angle, so it seems like they would have put up an even greater fuss about him turning heel. The only wrestler All Japan has elevated in the past few years has been Jun Akiyama. I really enjoy his work, but I wonder, who will he be wrestling in the future when the big three slow down? Is All Japan going to follow the same pattern as All Japan Women? How many hours of wrestling do you watch a week and how do you stay exited about it? Dan Cirquitella. Reno, Nevada. Response from Dave Meltzer, Santo is still one of the top drawing cards in Mexico. He's really a babyface everywhere but Arena Mexico, where he's booked as a heel because of his feuds with Negro Casas and Felino. It's funny because he was having a hard time getting cheered at Arena Mexico as a face when Casas, his top rival, who the fans in that building had grown to love, was his opponent, so it was a logical turn for that building. It's probably similar to Shane Douglas in Pittsburgh or Jerry Lawler in Memphis but in reverse, and that there are buildings they work as babyfaces even though they are heels on television, and the only weird part of this story is that Arena Mexico is the TV, but his persona and family as a face are so over that even appearing as a heel on TV every week doesn't make fans react to him as a heel in any other arena. The future of All Japan is something that everyone questions, and we've seen how lack of new talent doomed All Japan women, and how far down that promotion went over just a few years. I'd say realistically I watch 15 to 20 hours of pro wrestling every week. When it's bad wrestling, I don't get that excited about it, but the tact I take is that you try and learn something from everything. For me, when I stop learning something new when I watch current wrestling, it means the observer is going to quickly become outdated, which is one of my prime motivating factors, as I've seen so many people reach a point when they think they've learned everything about this business and then stop learning. As quickly as this business changes and evolves due to competition, it may make great historians, but they don't have a hell of a lot relevant to offer about the most important part of history, the present and the future. Music City. We read with interest every issue of The Observer, yet wonder when Music City Wrestling will receive more than just an occasional mention in the Here and There section. Although MCW has been in business barely 6 months, it has accomplished much. MCW has the third largest broadcast syndication network in the wrestling business. MCW has promoted matches featuring more than 50 different wrestlers. MCW is the only promotion that runs a traditional wrestling circuit: Nashville every Saturday, Louisville every Tuesday, plus spot towns. MCW promotes shows in 6 different states and continues to expand. MCW is the largest member of the NWA and has assisted the organization in its rapid growth. And most importantly, MCW is making money. In your April 27th issue, a reader commented on MCW. For the record, Jerry Jarrett has no financial interest in MCW, nor has he provided financing. Jarrett acts as an occasional advisor and is a friend. While this reader dislikes MCW's family entertainment image, it has brought children back to the live wrestling shows. By banning beer, MCW has reduced the stupid drunk quotient and created a better live atmosphere. MCW strives to be different from the rest. We continue to read that certain wrestlers have a problem with the existence of MCW, its owners, and its membership in the NWA. I wish these people would control their petty jealousies and concentrate on their own careers. Dennis Corralizzo should not be credited or blamed for letting MCW into the NWA. That honor should go to Howard Brody. Corralizzo has never met Burt Prentice and only knows Bill Behrens from meeting him at Old Smoky Mountain shows. Bill Behrens. Burt Prentice. Music City Wrestling. Religion. Please lay off the sarcasm of wrestlers' religious beliefs. For a person who has always protected the private lives and sexuality of wrestlers, you seem to have a problem with people who find Jesus. Any relationship with God is not to be questioned by you or I. Your comment about Nikita Koloff letting his hair grow and finding Jesus offended me. Woody Barton. Loverville, South Carolina. LOD, my brother and I have a bet on how old Animal and Hawk are. I say they are in their mid to late 40s. He says late 30s or early 40s. Bob Waydance. Lombard, Illinois. Response from Dave Meltzer. Animal was born January 26, 1960, which makes him 38. Hawk was born September 12, 1957, which makes him 40. Light heavyweights. Eric Bischoff is starting to become the Vince McMahon of the 90s. This has nothing to do with the success of WCW. This is based on his ambition on taking over foreign markets. I can't see WCW being successful in Japan on their own. Several foreign-based companies have run their own shows or worked in conjunction with others in Japan. The results have been failures and minor successes. WWF bombed when they ran big arenas in Japan in 1994. They lacked talent, following and understanding of the market. This was evident in the vehement anger of the audience after the Tenryu Yokozuna double count out in Osaka. EMLL had awesome talent when they ran 2 Japanese tours in 1997. But they couldn't pack even smaller arenas. Most of the stars they had used were previously used as undercard wrestlers for small groups. The shows had awesome talent and an awesome work rate, but they only drew well at Korakuen Hall. AAA was hot in 1994. But their business in Japan that year was lukewarm. This was despite New Japan promoting their shows and working in conjunction with them. This deal was so unsuccessful that New Japan never did a second tour with them. But that can also be chalked up to the disorganization of Antonio Pena and his staff. And what about the financial bloodbath that was the Megame Super Opticals SWS/WWF relationship? This was despite using all the big-name WWF talent working shows with Tenryu in the main events. Most of the shows were heavily papered. The best proof to show why Bischoff's idea won't work is based on the business the WCW World in Japan Tour in 1995 did. New Japan was achieving record business levels at the time on previous tours. When they ran shows with WCW, business was lukewarm. It showed that WCW wrestlers couldn't be in the top drawing position in Japan, even when working with Japan's #1 drawing promotion. I can possibly see one WCW show doing decent business by themselves, but only if they bring in their top guns. The best example of a Japanese group being successful working with a foreign promotion is FMW. This is based on what they did with ECW in December. But that is when you compare it with previous offices that used ECW as the focal point of their shows. Miki Ibaragi's Second Wings focused almost entirely on ECW. Both tours failed miserably for many reasons, including the audience not being overly familiar with the ECW wrestlers. IWA only did decent business with ECW at Korakuen Hall. That show rolled out in a building that does decent business for most groups. But Yokohama was a bomb. FMW didn't make ECW the focus of the tour. Instead, ECW was used to fill out the mid-card. They maximized the talent and strength of ECW, but FMW didn't use them on top to detract or steal the attention away from its own wrestlers as the drawing cards. I think Bischoff is being very pretentious on his attempt to make WCW into a player in the already overcluttered Japanese wrestling scene. But I can't deny his ambition in trying to make WCW the #1 company in the world, despite it technically not even being a profitable company. The WWF light heavyweight division can thus far be chalked up as a failure unless changes are made. Taka Michinoku has no credibility based on his challengers and his push. The division resembles the ill-fated WWF women's division of 1993 to 1995. Brian Christopher should have received a stronger push. He has charisma and gets heat very easily. Instead, he's being jobbed out and made to be a comic performer like Jerry Lawler. Some of the talented performers used to kick-start the division were only used as one-time deals. That was a big mistake since those performers could have built up the roster of talent for the division. Jerry Lynn, Super Crazy, Devon Storm, Flash Flanagan, Christopher Daniels, Felino and countless others could have made this division both credible and exciting. Instead, they were used as extras in an attempt to make this resemble an actual division. You also have to consider there is a decent amount of independent wrestlers who the WWF could have easily obtained, like Lance Diamond, Reckless Youth, Superboy, Kevin Quinn, Mike Lasansky, and Aaron O'Grady. Granted, there are a ton of inherent problems in obtaining luchadores as regulars. If the WWF couldn't obtain the cream of the crop from Mexico, then why don't they create their own? That idea could have been implemented by taking an American wrestler and giving him a mask doing a luchador gimmick. Unfortunately, the division will remain in the same state it is in. Taka Michinoku feuding with 3 Japanese foes who the fans don't know and have no interest in. WWF should have learned from WCW in developing a successful formula. They could have even just copied what WCW did in 1992, since that light heavyweight division was run decently when compared with the WWFs of today. WCW used Brian Pillman, who had a decent following to start with, putting him in solid matches against a variety of different opponents who were also decent workers. This provided some entertaining undercard matches on many pay-per-view shows. Pillman's matches were given an ample amount of time to get over. This worked a lot better than the WWF's idea of using talent with no following and just sending them out there to do high spots. Eric Bimbin. Brooklyn, New York. Response from Dave Meltzer: I'm pretty certain at this point that WCW is on its own a profitable entity, even factoring in some of the big salaries laid off on other books. Even if WCW isn't, in the larger scheme of things it is because it provides TBS and TNT with highly rated prime-time programming at a fraction of the cost it would take to produce the same amount of hours of first-run programming that wouldn't draw half the audience. Wrestling Observer Newsletter, May 4, 1998.